Good evening, everyone. Let's start with a simple but powerful idea. Your brain is not wired to thrive on noise. It's wired to thrive on focus. And silence, both external and internal, is the gateway to that focus. In today's hyper-stimulated world, we're constantly encouraged to react, to respond, to post, to compare. But here's what neuroscience tells us. Every time you shift your attention outward unnecessarily, you pay a cognitive tax. You lose precision. You dilute the clarity of your internal state. And over time, that compounds into chronic stress, burnout, and misalignment with your goals. When you focus on yourself, you're not being selfish. You're activating deep circuits in the prefrontal cortex that support self-regulation, goal-directed behavior, and long-term planning. You're reinforcing the default mode network, not for rumination, but for reflection, recalibration, and deep integration. And when you stay silent and not as avoidance, but as strategy, you remove the noise that scrambles your neural signal. You give your dopamine system space to reset. You reclaim your nervous system from reactivity and return it to intentionality. Because here's the truth. You don't need to announce your growth. You don't need to argue your value. Biology already built the system. You just have to stop interrupting it. The more you dial down external validation and tune into your internal state, your breath, your intentions, your progress, the more things around you begin to align. Not because the world changed, but because you did. In a world flooded with information, stimuli, and distractions, the human brain is constantly being pulled in dozens of directions at once. Every notification, every conversation, every comparison on social media demands a slice of our attention. While this may seem manageable moment to moment, the deeper cost is largely invisible. Our attention is not infinite. It is biologically limited, governed by how our neural circuits manage energy, prioritize stimuli, and allocate focus. Every time we respond to something unnecessary, especially when it does not serve our long-term goals, we are paying a tax. Not a tax in money, but in energy, clarity, and long-term mental resilience. This is something modern neuroscience has repeatedly emphasized. Our brain operates within constraints. It cannot and does not process everything equally. Instead, it uses filters, systems designed to prioritize what we focus on and suppress what we don't. These systems are critical for our survival and performance, but they are fragile. Overload them, and they break down when we constantly react to external noise, whether it's someone's opinion, the latest trend, or the urge to defend our worth. We dilute these systems. We weaken our ability to think clearly, to plan ahead, and to remain grounded in who we are. It's not just about time lost to distraction. It's about what happens to the structure and function of our brain when we live in a reactive state. The more frequently we divide our attention, the more we train our neural circuits to expect fragmentation. We become less capable of deep work, less tolerant of silence, and more anxious when left alone with our thoughts. This isn't a psychological weakness. It's a neurological adaptation to chaos. The brain becomes what it practices, and if it practices distraction, that becomes its default state. What people often fail to realize is that much of their suffering isn't caused by the events of their life, but by the constant cognitive leakage created by focusing on things that aren't relevant or helpful. Every thought loop about someone else's opinion, every internal debate about what to say or how to respond to something meaningless, those are mental tabs open in the background. And just like on a computer, too many open tabs slow everything down. Tasks take longer, your creativity fades, and emotional regulation becomes harder. You snap more quickly, you doubt yourself more often, and you struggle to make clear decisions because your brain is using its limited bandwidth to juggle too many irrelevant files. When you begin to focus inward, truly focus, not just retreat, you give your brain the space it needs to repair itself. You conserve energy that would otherwise be wasted on explaining, proving, defending, or reacting. You start to build neural pathways that are optimized for self-awareness, for planning, for discipline. Your internal dialogue becomes cleaner. Your decisions become sharper. You no longer feel the constant need to justify yourself because your sense of direction is no longer dependent on noise from the outside. What makes this shift so powerful is that it is both cognitive and physiological. Your stress hormones begin to regulate, your sleep improves. Your sense of urgency gets replaced with a sense of intentionality. You stop chasing control in the external world and start regaining control of your internal state. And when that happens, things begin to feel less overwhelming. Not because life became easier, but because your perception of life is no longer fractured. You're operating from a coherent baseline. This is why silence and solitude are not luxuries. They are necessities. They're the conditions under which your brain can defragment, where your nervous system can settle, and where clarity can return. When you choose not to engage every time you're provoked or distracted, you're not avoiding life. You're preparing yourself to live it with greater focus. You're training your brain to work for you, not against you. In the end, this isn't about avoiding the world. It's about filtering the world intelligently. It's about recognizing that the ability to focus deeply and selectively is not just a productivity skill. It's a survival skill in the modern age. The people who master that are not just calmer. They are more effective. They are more present, and they are far more capable of building the kind of life where everything truly does fall into place. Not because they forced it, but because they stopped wasting their energy where it didn't belong. In the moments when we stop speaking, stop reacting, and choose stillness, something remarkable begins to happen inside the brain. What feels like doing nothing on the outside is, in fact, one of the most powerful processes available to us. It's during these quieter, uninterrupted periods that the brain gets a chance to shift from reacting to reorganizing. The noise of external demands fades, and what takes its place is a subtle, often unnoticeable recalibration, deep within the nervous system. We rarely notice it in real time. This is when lasting internal change becomes possible. The human brain is built to adapt. It reshapes itself based on what we give our attention to, what we repeat, and what we emotionally engage with. This process, known as structural and functional rewiring, is not something we force manually. It happens in the background, but there's a catch. It doesn't occur well in the middle of chaos. For the brain to change in a meaningful, durable way, it needs room. It needs periods of calm, reflection, and stillness. And this is where silence becomes more than absence. It becomes the condition for deeper growth. When we are constantly in motion, when our minds are filled with talking, scrolling, reacting, or simply trying to keep up with the flood of incoming information, our mental resources are spent just trying to stay afloat. In that state, the brain is stuck in short-term survival mode. It's not integrating, it's not making sense of experiences, and it's certainly not reshaping itself in ways that support long-term development. But when you remove the need to perform, to explain, to respond, it moves from reacting to consolidating, from noise to integration. This is not about avoiding engagement or hiding from life. It's about creating the conditions where insights can form and changes can stick. Just as muscles repair and grow not during the workout but during rest, the brain strengthens its pathways during quiet. This is especially true when we pair silence with attention. When we become aware of what's happening internally without trying to broadcast it outward, we give the brain a chance to refine its networks. Thoughts begin to untangle. Emotions that seemed overwhelming begin to clarify. Patterns emerge, and with enough repetition, a new internal landscape takes shape, one that is more aligned, more resilient, and more deliberate. People often associate silence with passivity, with inaction, but biologically, the opposite is true. When the external world quiets, the internal world becomes more active, but not in a chaotic way. The systems in the brain responsible for insight, self-reflection, memory consolidation, and meaning-making begin to light up. These aren't the circuits we use when we're talking or reacting. They're the ones we use when we're understanding. And in this way, silence becomes not a void, but a vessel. It becomes the container in which your past experiences can be metabolized into wisdom. There's a reason many of our most powerful realizations come to us not during noise, but in moments of quiet, in a walk alone, in a moment of solitude, in the gap between one activity and the next. It's because the brain finally has access to the space it needs to do its real work, not just to survive, but to transform. It begins to reshape how we think, how we feel, and how we relate to the world. And those changes rooted in silence become the foundations for how we show up when we return to the noise. This process is slow. It is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. but it is real and it is measurable, not just in brain scans, but in your life. Over time, if you honor these moments of stillness, you will notice that you are less reactive, more composed, more sure of what matters. You will begin to trust your own mind again, not because it's loud, but because it has become clear. And with clarity comes confidence, not the loud performative kind, but the quiet kind that doesn't need an audience to feel real. So when you choose silence, when you withdraw from the pressure to be constantly seen or heard, you are not stepping back. You are stepping inward. And it is in that inward space where your brain, freed from the static, can begin the real work of shaping who you are becoming. Not for applause, not for attention, but for alignment. And that is where everything begins to change. Not all at once, but deeply and lastingly. There's a quiet but powerful transformation that happens when a person begins to focus on themselves. Not in a self-absorbed way, but in a deliberate, grounded, and honest way. It's the moment when attention, once scattered across opinions, expectations, and distractions, is pulled inward and redirected toward intention. This act of internal focus isn't merely a shift in perspective, it's a complete recalibration of how the brain processes, prioritizes, and directs action. It's where clarity begins and where long-term growth becomes possible. The human brain has built-in systems that allow it to organize behavior across time. These systems don't operate well when we're constantly reacting to the external environment. They come online when we pause, when we reflect, and when we commit to something more stable than the chaos around us. When you truly begin to focus on yourself, you awaken networks in the brain that are designed to guide you forward, not keep you spinning in place. These are the systems responsible for planning self-control, delayed gratification, and sustained attention. They don't respond to drama. They respond to direction. When a person is constantly engaged with the outside world, trying to prove something, defend something, or keep up, they rarely access these systems effectively. Instead, their energy gets consumed by the short-term circuits in the brain, the ones that are fast but shallow. These circuits can help you survive, but they don't help you evolve. They're designed to detect threats, to handle quick decisions, and to respond to social pressure. But if you spend too much time in that mode, you never build the internal architecture necessary for growth. You're always managing, never building. Focusing on yourself interrupts that cycle. It tells the brain, we are not just reacting anymore. We are choosing. We are no longer outsourcing our sense of self to others. We are generating it from within. In this state, the brain becomes more strategic, more long-term in its outlook. Instead of being pulled in 10 directions, you start to organize your actions around what actually matters to you. You begin to act from values, not from pressure. And over time, those values become reinforced as stable pathways in the brain, making it easier to stay aligned, even when the world tries to pull you off course. The interesting thing is, this shift doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be visible to anyone else. In fact, the most profound transformations are often the quietest. They happen when you decide not to explain yourself. When you make choices based on who you want to be, not what you want others to think. When you stop broadcasting and start listening to your thoughts, your instincts, your inner feedback. These choices activate something incredibly powerful, a return to internal guidance. The brain, when given space and consistency, becomes remarkably good at self-correcting. It tells you when you're off track. It tells you what needs to change. But it can only do that when your focus is directed inward long enough for the signal to rise above the noise. The more time you spend in this state, the more you learn to trust it. You no longer feel the need to constantly seek advice for every step or validation for every move. It's not that you become closed off. It's that you become more selective. You realize that not every opinion deserves space in your mind. Not every conflict needs your energy, and not every opportunity is meant for you. This kind of clarity comes from alignment, and alignment comes from consistency in focusing on your own internal path. People sometimes mistake this for being selfish or detached, but it's neither. It's responsible. When you manage your own attention, when you learn to hold your energy rather than give it away impulsively, you become more stable for yourself and for others. You become a person who doesn't just react, but responds with clarity, who doesn't just chase outcomes, but builds direction. And this shift, while not always visible in the short term, has deep and lasting effects. It's not a change that happens overnight. It takes patience. It takes moments of uncertainty, of questioning, of sitting in the discomfort of silence. But through that process, the brain adapts. It learns a new pattern that when you turn inward with discipline and honesty, you find something stronger than distraction. You find purpose. And purpose, once grounded in focus, doesn't need constant motivation. It begins to carry itself. This is the quiet power of internal attention. Not flashy, not performative, but foundational. And the more you stay committed to it, the more everything around you begins to shift, not because the world changed, but because your relationship to it became anchored in something real. There is a fundamental system in the human brain that governs how we experience motivation, desire, effort, and reward. It is responsible for the forward momentum we feel when we're pursuing a goal, when we're in anticipation of something meaningful, or when we sense progress. But it is also the system that becomes hijacked the fastest by the world we live in. Every notification, every like, every spike of approval taps into it, often subtly and repeatedly. And over time, we become conditioned to chase the spike rather than the substance. The problem is not that we seek reward. This is built into us. The issue is that the sources of our reward have become distorted. What once evolved to motivate us toward food, shelter, learning, relationships, and long-term outcomes is now being pulled toward things that are instant, artificial, and shallow. We check our phones not because we care deeply, but because the brain expects a hit. We explain ourselves online, not for clarity, but because we want a rush of confirmation. These repeated behaviors are not random. They are neurochemical loops. And if left unchecked, they wear out the very system we rely on to stay motivated and fulfilled. Silence interrupts this loop. So does solitude. Not because they are inherently noble, but because they remove the unnecessary stimuli that constantly manipulate our reward system. When you stop speaking unnecessarily, when you stop engaging every time you're pulled, you create a space where your internal chemistry can reset. It may feel boring at first. It may feel like something is missing. That feeling is not emptiness, it's withdrawal. Withdrawal from the constant drip of dopamine that you've trained your brain to expect from external validation. In that space, something important happens. The brain begins to recalibrate. It starts to reduce its reliance on quick hits and starts to resensitize to things that are slower, deeper, and more meaningful. The kind of reward you get from making real progress, from being honest with yourself, from seeing growth that no one else sees. That reward is quieter, but it's also more stable. It doesn't crash when the applause stops. It doesn't disappear when no one is watching. It stays with you. This is not just theory, it's biology. When the dopamine system is constantly overstimulated by external sources, it becomes less responsive. You need more and more stimulation to get the same effect. Over time, things that once brought joy start to feel flat. You lose motivation not because you're lazy, but because your brain has adapted to noise. And the only way out of that is not to chase louder noise, but to remove the noise entirely. Choosing silence, focusing on yourself, and not reacting immediately allows that system to return to its natural rhythm. It gives your brain space to build anticipation again. It allows effort to feel rewarding again, and it shifts your motivation away from reaction and back toward intention. You begin to enjoy showing up for yourself, not for what others think, but because it feels right. You begin to find satisfaction not just in the result, but in the process. That's not a motivational quote. It's a shift in brain chemistry. Over time, you start to notice the difference. The things that once felt addictive start to lose their pull. The habits that once felt difficult become part of your rhythm. You're not swinging between extremes, you're simply showing up more consistently. You don't need to announce your progress because you feel it internally. It becomes part of who you are. And that kind of motivation is hard to shake because it's no longer dependent on whether or not someone else approves. This is why silence and internal focus are so powerful. Not because they make you passive, but because they return you to your own center of gravity. Or they let your brain settle. They let your system rest and rebuild. And once that rebuilding happens, your pursuit of growth becomes cleaner. It's not driven by comparison. It's not fueled by fear. It's rooted in something steady. And when motivation comes from that place, it tends to last. Eventually, you come to a point where external validation becomes optional. Nice, but not necessary. It means being willing to sit in silence while the world keeps moving. It means being okay with being misunderstood. It means choosing not to engage in every conflict or explain every boundary. These small choices add up. They reinforce a mindset where your peace becomes more important than your ego, where your direction matters more than your image. In time, what once felt like effort becomes your new baseline. What once felt like restraint becomes ease. Your nervous system, no longer hijacked by constant alerts, learns to rest. Your mind, once cluttered by opinions and assumptions, becomes clearer. And your life without dramatic changes on the outside begins to feel different, not perfect, but aligned, sustainable, peaceful. And that feeling of being anchored in yourself becomes a kind of quiet power that no one can give or take away. It's not magic. It's the result of choosing clarity over chaos, focus over noise, and intention over reaction, over and over again until your system resets and your life reflects that new rhythm. The world didn't need to fall into place. It was always there. You just needed to stop scattering yourself long enough to see it.